So, what is house? What is house music? It's actually an incredibly difficult term to precisely define simply because it means many different things to many different people in many different contexts. If you ask the guys who first started the movement in the early 80s, house doesn't mean a specific style of track necessarily, it's more of a culture, more of a movement that happened in that early 80s to late 80s period. I mean, yes, the BPM was broadly speaking in a certain range and there was a 4 to the floor kick drum, but that was about it. There wasn't a certain style of bass line or a certain style of percussion. It was just house music. It was a cultural thing. And you'll find that pretty much everyone has their own interpretation of the term. The dubstep guys consider basically everything at 128 BPM to be house. The guys just walking down the street who aren't into dance music, they're going to consider club music as a whole to be house music. If you ask a quote-unquote house head, someone who's heavily into the scene, what is house, then they'll have their own nuanced interpretation of the term specific to their age and the cities they've grown up in. Therefore, the term house music is incredibly contextual. It all depends on the context you use it. So how am I going to use this term house throughout this course? I'm going to use the modern day interpretation that you might see, say, floating about on Beatport, or maybe a YouTube channel, a YouTube network, or a SoundCloud group, that sort of thing, and I define it as follows. First of all, the bit that pretty much everyone agrees on, the BPM and the kick drums. The kick drums are in a 4 to the floor configuration. The kicks are on every single beat of the bar in a straight repetitive manner. We call this a 4 to the floor kick drum or a 4 on the floor kick drum. Then the BPM is typically between, say, 115 and 128. For reference, this track here is 123. Which is a dB or two slower than average. I would say 125, 126 is going to be about the most common BPM at the moment. And then also something else that's generally standard across every definition of house, there will be a hi-hat on the off beat. Notice they land exactly in between every single kick drum. And that leads me on to the next defining feature of house. In general, the emphasis tends to be on the offbeat and not the downbeat. In other words, the emphasis for the groove or the synths or the bass line, anything that defines the rhythm, tends to be in between the kick drums and not on the kick drums. If you're listening to the track at a club or a festival or maybe a rave, if you're pointing your finger or making your dance moves, whatever you do, to the offbeats, to the hi-hat, then that is emphasis on the offbeat, so it's more likely to be house. It may sound a bit crazy if you're somewhat new to dance music and clubbing culture, but the way a lot of people describe the difference between genres is how they dance to it. In addition, the sounds used are a lot less in your face, they're a lot less aggressive. As other genres, if you look at, say, some bits of techno, there are some extremely aggressive sounds. If you look at big room house or electro house, there's aggressive sounds, or especially dubstep and drum and bass. House music's just a lot less aggressive. It's got a different kind of energy. It's not a ragey energy, it's more of an emotional, dancey energy. And finally, before I show you two other examples of house tracks in different styles, I have a nice little definition to compare house and techno, because there tends to be a lot of confusion between these two genres. They share a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. There is more emotion in house than techno, there is more melody in house than techno, and there is less repetition in house than techno. Of course, there's lots of overlap here, and people spend their entire lives arguing, is this track, is this artist house or techno or even tech house? I personally wouldn't get too worried about the difference, just make cool music, but certainly these defining features will help guide you in understanding what people tend to mean when they refer to house. But let me show you these other tracks too.
This is done like Joshua. 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 This is done like Joshua.
fact, I do want to point out one feature of this that's incredibly important. I would personally argue without the hi-hats on the offbeat, it would actually be techno because of where the emphasis in the groove is. So if I turn off these hi-hats,
This is done like Joshua.
did you hear how all of a sudden the groove had an emphasis on the kick drum?
This is done like Joshua.
Whereas with the hi-hats on the offbeats,
This is done like Joshua. This is done like Joshua.
interesting stuff, right? And finally, a slower house track at 118 BPM, this one with a tropical house sort of flavour to it.
We drop it down, we drop it down, we drop it down, we drop it down like this.
And there you go, that is house music, and they are the defining features.